Okay, so I'm going to show you how to do a notched collar lapel on a quarter scale mannequin. Okay, so this is the lapel. This is actually the lapel facing, but this part is the lapel. So if you hear that, that's what we're referring to. This is the collar, and this is the notch that we're referring to. So the tricky part is getting all of this fabric to come into this area and not get all bunchy, not have a hole, and be nice and even. Again, this is what's framing the face, so it's important that everything be balanced and not different sizes, because this is the spot that your eyes first gonna go to. So the first thing we're going to do is sew our darts onto our back piece. So I have some darts pinned. In order to sew the darts, I fold my dart in half. I put a pin through, making sure that the point hits both lines when it goes through, because once you check that, you are guaranteed that the needle is also going to go through both. So you can see here, the pin is hitting both pencil lines, and so the needle will also hit both pencil lines. Going to sew from the tip to the feet of the dart, and you don't want to backstitch because it can create bunching and puckering, so you want to just start right at the tip of the dart. Let's see if I can. Make sure you remove your pins, and you're going to go straight down without backstitching. It's one of the only times you don't backstitch. And then you're going to tie off the dart links, the dart tip threads, double knot so that it's nice and it doesn't come untied, and loosen up, and then trim those away. And so that's what creates a nice dart tip. So I'm going to do that with all 4 darts on the back bodice. For the next 2, I'm not going to tie the tip because this is a sample, and I want to expedite this video a little bit so you don't have to be so bored watching it. But you would want to tie all of them. Last but not least, so just gonna skip this one. Okay, so we'll set that aside. Next, we want to do our front pieces, and these are going to be mirror images of one another. So you want to make sure that they're not facing the same way, otherwise your seams are going to end up on the wrong side. And then we have a princess seam here. And so on the princess seam, you're going to have some notches. Oh, I didn't do my notches there. 1 second. If that happens, you can always just lay your pattern back down. I'm going to mark this notch here, and I also want my match point there. Mark my notch. Okay. This one has the notch marked, clipped, but I'm going to mark it with my pencil because I'm going to clip into these. So I'm going to put this one to the side. Before you start, and when you're sewing curves, you always want to do a stay stitch. So the stay stitch is going to be just inside the seam allowance. So here it'll be 3/8 of an inch on the curve. You don't have to worry about back stitching for stay stitching. And I'll do the same thing on the princess side panel. So basically you're putting the bodice of your design together first. And this is so when you clip into it, your stay stitching prevents the fabric from tearing any further. It is also a nice guide for matching things up. So again, we want to make sure that these are mirror images of one another. I love to just always put everything out on the table like this to make sure that it is actually mirror images. So I'm going to do right sides together. First, I want to match my notches. And I can go ahead and clip because I've marked that notch and it's now pinned. You can clip in wherever there's a curve. At where it's straight, you don't want to bother, but you do want to clip on both curves so that both allow the fabric to move around the curve so that it can align. So again, I'm going to then pin at the end and then in the center, and I just kind of ease that in, stretch it a little bit, make sure the edges, the raw edges are matching up, and then also pin at the bottom of the seam. So I always kind of do the notch and then the two end points, and again just kind of making sure everything is aligning in between, usually putting one in between there. So I then go ahead and stitch. I like to stitch with when my fabric is more, the fullness of the fabric is on top so that if there is any puckering or gathering, I can avoid that as I sew. Again, I'm going to sew this at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. It should be right past that stay stitch. Again, it's a nice little guide for the stitching. Making sure I'm not getting any puckers in this curve as I'm going, kind of smoothing things out. And we would press this seam open using a ham. I'm just going to press it with my fingers for right now, and I will take a pause and go press it in a second. So that's one, and again, we really want to make sure mirror images, right sides together. Clip in on the curves. Pin the ends together. No, I'm sorry. And then we are pinning in the middle. And like I said, kind of stretching this. Again, sewing from the side that has the fullness on it. Oops. So that I can avoid any puckers like that. And again, pressing open the seams once you're finished. Using a ham usually. This is a pretty slight curve, and it being so small, not so important to use a ham, but it would be very handy and would totally smooth this out right away. All right, so we have mirror images. Now we're going to put our back to our front, so we're matching up shoulder seams and side seams. Want to always make sure that our darts are going towards the center. Half-inch seam allowance on this shoulder seams here. You'll notice on the patterns that it's 1/4 of an inch seam allowance on some of the lapel stitching seam allowances. So be careful to check the patterns that I've given you for this. The 1/4 scale patterns, they are marked, so they do differ. Usually it's a 1/2 inch seam allowance, but sometimes on these smaller things where there's a lot of detail and tight corners, it's 1/4 inch. You can use 1/4 inch seam allowance on your full size as well, and sometimes you'll see that in the patterns, but I tend to prefer to use a 1/2 inch for that because you can always trim away, but you can't add it, as we know. All right, so now we have a bodice, back and front. And we're going to go ahead and add the collar to this because we have the lapel, see it flipping back here. But now we need to add the collar around the neckline there. So we're going to add the under collar. And the under collar has a center back seam and it's cut on the bias. And so we want to stitch at that 1/2 inch seam down the center back. And press it open. And this is cut on the bias because it's rolling around the body, you know, it's around the neck and rolling and folding. So the bias helps to create that shape and helps to keep that all having a nice fall. That's what that's called when the collar falls. So I'm just kind of pressing open my shoulder seams because I'm going to put this collar all the way around the neckline. So I'm going to also do a stay stitch around my neckline here. So this is 1/4 of an inch. So I'm going to go pretty tight to the edge for my stay stitching. And again, this is because I'm going to clip into this. It's also because it's a point of a lot of tension and wear and tear. This is where kind of like every time you move your arms and things like that, that's where it's pulling around the neckline a little. So it's good to add a little reinforcement. We will have another stitch line here. And you don't have to stay stitch the collar itself. All right, so now we are ready to put our collar on. I'm going to find my center back. So I just fold the center back of the neckline in half and kind of give it a little mark. And then this is easy because I have my center back line as a seam. And so we want to put the curved line to the neckline. And we're also going to pay very close attention to the match point. So the match point is going to be right here on the corner on both ends. And we need to stop stitching when we hit that match point. This is also the match point on the lapel where that collar is going to end. We do not want to continue to the end of this seam here. It's important because later on we're going to need to maneuver around this, and if it's sewn down, it's going to create a pulling in that corner area where all of those seams are meeting. So we're going to match our center back, making sure that it's the curved edge that's getting sewn to the collar or to the neckline. I'm going to pin it center back there should be a little notch at the shoulder seam. And then of course we're matching the match point up with the match point of the lapel. And again, that is where you're going to end your stitch. So make sure that you put a pin there in order to demarcate that. And if you're having trouble fitting this in, you can clip into that neckline. If you don't have to, better not to, but you can if you need to. And then we go ahead and do the other side. So again, we have a notch that lines up with the seam allowance, or I'm sorry, the shoulder seam. And then we're going to match up the match point again. And again, that match point is where we're going to end our stitching. So I always like to put a pin right there so I know to end there. And again, I just split the difference and put a pin in between those two pins. So I'm going to then sew again with the fabric with the fullness on top. And I'm going to stitch at 1/4 inch. And again, starting at the match point, not at the very end. So I'm going to start right where that pin is. Right there, not at the very end. Okay. Probably one of the most important things to remember about sewing a collar and a lapel. And this is 1/4 inch seam allowance. And we do want a back stitch here. I lost that. Hold on one second. I took my pin out too soon. So I go ahead and I put my foot down, my needle down, and then I can remove my pin. That's a little bit better. Okay, 1/4 inch seam allowance the whole way across. Making sure as I'm stitching that any seam allowance I'm crossing does get sewn down in the correct direction. We don't want any puckering or bunching, especially around the neckline, you know. Again, this is the area that it gets a lot of visibility, so we want to be super careful about this. Going nice and slow. Anytime we stop and adjust stuff, make sure you put your foot down. And again, stopping at that match point and no further. And make sure you backstitch. That's the hardest part too, is like really getting that backstitch in without going too far. All right, so now what you'll notice is we have a little jacket lapel. So now we have to put on our facing, right? So it's starting to look like a jacket with a lapel, but we have to face all this. So now we're going to set this aside. We're going to press it, but I'm going to go ahead and make my lapel facing first. So what we have now are mirror images of lapel facing, and they are interfaced with iron-on interfacing, as is the upper collar. So what we need to do is we're going to create a neckline. So we have to attach the back facing to the two lapel facing. So we're going to go right sides together. And these are 1/2 inch seam allowance here. And it's important to keep track of this, because if this collar lapel facing doesn't match the shell, the bodice shell that we just made, it's going to be problematic fitting all of this in. It has to be you have to be super cognizant of your seam allowances when putting together the collar and lapel, because if it gets off, everything's going to be off and nothing's going to fit. They have to be exactly the same. They're going to basically get sewn together and then flipped right side out. So again, we're going to press this open. And again, making sure these are facing each other, mirror images. And now we're going to, we have right side here, put right sides together. And again, this is the collar, the upper collar. So we want to find our center back. And again, we have match points on this right here and right here. And those are going to match up with the lapel match points right here and right here. Okay. Those are marked on your patterns. I just didn't transfer them over. They were on the other side or something. So we're going to go center back again. Oh, one last thing. We will do, you can do some stay stitching here. Because the interfacing, I'm going to actually skip it for the sake of time too. So right sides together. At center back. Pin in. And then again, we're going to pin at the shoulder seam of the facing. And then again at that match point. Beautiful, beautiful match point. And again, really important that we don't sew past that. We have to end at that match point. This in here. Making sure to ease that seam in there. Put as many pins in these curves as you need to get that nice and flat without any puckering. Again, here at the side seam. And then again at that match point. Aligning the raw edges always. Want to make sure those stay aligned. And sew on the side that has more fullness again. So again, we are starting at the match point. So starting here where the pin is, not at the end of this, right here is where I'm going to start sewing. I'm going to end at the other side, same thing. This is a 1/4 inch seam allowance. One more little pin in here to keep those raw edges aligned. Okay. And again, couple forward, couple backward, not to go past that. Anything you need to adjust, make sure you put down your foot, trying to lift out the pins as you're going. And then again, stopping at that match point and making sure you do a little back stitch. Oops, thread here. So now what we have is another collar lapel. And so these two are going to go together, face to face. And then we're going to sew around the edges. I just have to go press these. So I'm going to pause this really quick. And okay, so now we have our outer. This is the garment. And then this is our facing, all interfaced. You can do the back facing with interfacing too. I just kind of skipped it. So we're going to be putting right sides together, matching up the collars and the lapels. Okay. And what we're going to end up doing is we're going to sew from match point to match point along the collar. And then we're going to sew from match point on the lapel down to the hem and then the other lapel. So first we want to pin everything together. Now we're going to do the collar first. So the thing about this is that you want to move all of the seam allowance away from the collar because we're going to sew from there and we don't want to catch any of that because we want it to be all mobile in there. So it is very important that we get all those fabric, all the seam allowance together and that the match point is really matching together and that our raw edges are aligning. I'm going to pin around the entire collar. Again, matching up all the raw edges, making sure everything is on center, that our points are matching up. And again, back to this match point where again, all of that seam allowance is going to get pushed away from the match point on the collar, away, all of it. You don't want to catch that in there. So if you have to, you can put a pin in here, keeping all of that away from that. And we're going to start sewing at that point, not at the end. We're not going to go off the edge. We're going to go straight up from that match point and around and end at the other match point. All right, so here we go. Always double, triple check to make sure you're not catching any seam allowance in there. Putting the needle in right at that point, Make sure you're not catching anything in there. Make sure you also backstitch and also make sure again that you want to, you're going to use your corner stitching techniques. I'm not sure how you learn this, but when I approach my corner, I'm going to go down to a #1 stitch at about 3/4 to a 1/2 inch there. Just tightens up the stitch a little. And then when you get to the corner, you're going to put the needle in. You're going to raise up the foot, pivot, put the foot down, do 1 stitch diagonally, leave the needle in, pivot again. Keep your stitch length at #1 for about 3/4 inch to 1 inch. Then you can go back up to 2, 2.5, 3 even if you are sewing at a 3. Keep going. As you approach your next corner, again, go down to a #1 stitch length. As you approach that corner, we want to stop when we get to our seam allowance. Put your needle down, your foot up, pivot, do 1 stitch, needle down, foot up, pivot. And again, we are going to do 3/4 inch or so, #1 stitch, back up to #2. And at that match point, we are going to do a back stitch, not sewing over, do not cross over that. Because it will give you trouble. Okay, so it should look exactly like that. Okay, next, we're going to flip all that seam allowance away and we're going to focus on the lapels now. So now we're going to come from this match point out to the corner and then down. And again, doing the same stitching on the lapel in terms of your corners. And this technique, it makes it so there's a little extra room for you to turn. We're also going to trim away some of that excess. And again, we are going to start right at that point right there. And again, as we approach the corner, go down to number 1. It slows it down for you. Also just tightens it up, makes it nice and clean in case of any clipping or trimming that gets a little close to the seam. Again, needle down, foot up, pivot, and 1 stitch, needle down, foot up, and pivot. And then we are going at a number 1 stitch again. Back up to a 2.5. All the way down. Now, if you know your hem length on a jacket like this, you can actually do your corner stitch here. This is a 1/2 inch seam allowance at the bottom here. So I'm going to go down to a number 1 stitch, put my needle down, foot up, do 1 little pivot, 1 little stitch, and then back out, back up to number 2, 2.5, off the edge of the facing, and a little back stitch. And what this will do, I'll turn this for you so you can see. You got to trim away the corners to create space for the turn. And what this will do is create a little hem for us, which you'll see when I press it, but that will be the finished edge. And then you can basically loop your, you'd be able to finish it off this way with your lining looping into this, potentially even, you know, machine sewing it into this, and then, you know, connecting it to the lapel facing. Okay, so going to do my other side of the lapel, and we are almost done here. Just trimming away some threads. I would wait to trim away the corners of this before you check it, but I'm going to do the other one so we can check both at once. So again, matching our lapel corners and beginning our stitching, putting all that seam allowance now towards the collar, and beginning our stitching right, oops, right there at the match point. Okay. And again, super important at this point not to catch any of that extra other seam allowance from the collars or from the lapels or anything. Put the needle in right where we're going to start stitching. Couple forward, couple back. Again, is important to, oops, that could have been too far. We'll see if I made a mistake. That's cool. It's good for you guys to see what happens if that makes a mistake. Again, down to number 1. So approach our corner, needle down, foot up, pivot, 1 stitch, needle down, foot up, pivot, and then back to our number 2 stitch. Same thing down here, going to go down to number 1 stitch, pivot, and go ahead and finish that up. Change to my 2. There we go. Stitch. And again, I'm going to trim off these corners for right now because I know that's going to be fine. It's not really the part we're concerned about. Before I go ahead and trim away these, I want to make sure I flip it. I'm going to check it. And what we're checking is this, you know, the corners aren't going to turn nice, but we're checking to make sure there's no pulling, no stitches, no openings there. So we're good on that side. This might be the side where I may have gone over a little. Yeah, it's a little bit grosser, right? But that actually should press out. So once I trim away some of this, these little bumpiness, it's gonna go away. So it's not major, whatever it did. And you would always use the same color thread as the garment, so you wouldn't see that. Sometimes you'll see people hand sewing that together, so you don't see any of that stitching at all. So depends on how fine. This is kind of a dressmaking technique of putting a lapel in. It's definitely not a tailoring technique. You'll learn that you'll learn that next year. So going to trim away my corners. For me, I always trim first across, straight across, and then I kind of do 2 little other ones to taper it off. And the other thing we can do to help with some of that bulkiness is very carefully trim away some of the excess seam allowance in here. You must be very careful not to cut into the garment, because then you'll have to do the whole thing over. If you accidentally trim too far, you're going to create a hole and it will be unfixable. So do be careful when you're trimming this, and be sure not to trim too close, because we want to push these points out nicely and make sure they're nice and sharp. But if you trim too close, that's going to end up being a gaping hole. So go ahead and trim off top, side, and same thing here. You can go ahead and grade seams even, you can go ahead and trim all kinds of things away here if you need to. It depends on the kind of garment. If things are pulling, you can always clip as well. But again, super careful not to do anything gratuitous, because you will end up remaking your garment if you accidentally trim something away that you don't mean to. Hope I didn't just do that. Okay, and so now we can flip it. This is the most fun part. And I'm going to just use a little tool to move those collars and lapel points out carefully. Whatever tip you use, you don't want to push too hard again, because if you did that trimming nicely, it can go through. Right, beautiful. So now I'm going to go ahead and take this and press it. And again, you can see how it's starting to look like a jacket. Turn these and this becomes a nice little front for you. Be right back. I'm going to pause this and then. All right, so we have pressed version. This is the first one I did today. And now we have the one I just pressed. Okay, so fits nicely. I did find one little pucker right here that I'm not psyched on, but if this was a real garment, I would fix it. But it's just a sample, so I think we're gonna go forward. We're gonna fold this over and just double check that everything looks right. Center front. And our lapel's nice and even, no puckering. We have nice lines here. That's how you sew a lapel.